Hello and welcome to the Family Beacon podcast from Minnesota Family Council. Today I'm joined by a super special guest, Renn. I'll get to introducing him in a moment. If you guys, I imagine we're going to get a lot of traction on this episode. So I want to give a quick background on what Minnesota Family Council is and what we do. We are the state's only and largest Christian organization dedicated to political engagement and renewal, to elections, to policy, but also to education and litigation. Providing the church, being a voice for the church in the public square, if that would be a short way of putting it. And speaking of that, many Christians have felt over the last 10 years or so that there has been a turning point for Christian political engagement. Churches have become more divided over social issues, and they've seen their traditional alliances with the conservative and more religious wing of the Republican Party begin to unravel. Much of that was already in play by June 2015, which is when I think a lot of people started to notice this change. In that month, we saw the Supreme Court release the Obergefell decision legalizing gay marriage across the country, and a businessman named Donald Trump announced his candidacy for president. But certainly, even before that, and certainly since that time, churches, theologians, cultural commentators have been asking, what has changed? What went wrong? And how can we understand the cultural and political situation in the Christian church and in North America that we find ourselves in today? One of the people asking those questions and answering those questions is Renn, who joins me today. Renn served as a partner at Accenture, a global consulting firm, and more recently as a writer and consultant at the Manhattan Institute and the American Reformer. In a 2022 article for First Things magazine, he laid out a new framework for Christians to understand and respond to the cultural shifts we're experiencing. He's expanded that framework in his new book, which I really enjoyed and commend to you, Life in the Negative World, which is making waves in the Christian community across the country. And I think it's helping Christians bring about a paradigm shift in the way we engage the culture. Renn joins me now. Welcome, Renn, so much. We're so glad you're here.
Thanks for having me on.
Renn, can you introduce yourself? Well, I sort of already did that, but anything you'd like to add to that, and tell us how you came to write this book, which I have to say, I just has been such a paradigm shift for me.
Yes, well, as you highlighted, I had sort of three careers. One was in management consulting and technology. The second was in urban policy, which I still do a little bit of urban policy and public policy work there. And then the third I sort of got into by accident, which has been my sort of the future of the church, if you will, cultural diagnostics. I always say that I am a cultural critic, not a pastor or a theologian. And that gives me a different perspective on the issues. You don't typically see me, arguing for particular theological positions because I'm not, that's not my lane per se, but that I also have the ability to do things that pastors can't do. And the evangelical world has been overly reliant on pastors, in my view, to have the answer to everything. Got to be the all-purpose experts on everything. Right. Which nobody is really equipped to do. And so I just wanted to give like some additional tools that people, and of course the pastors themselves can use to help make sense of the world. And so I just, what happened was I saw back in 2014 that the world was changing and that the cultural environment in which contemporary evangelicalism had based all of its ministry strategies was about to undergo a turn that would, I'm not going to say make them obsolete, but fundamentally challenge, how people were doing business. And so I ended up, I sort of made some personal notes about that, but really didn't do much with it. A few years later, when I was living in New York City, I actually started a newsletter focused on Christian issues, which was really about a problem that I still write a lot about myself still, and I'm very interested in, which is why men turn to online influencers, but not the church. I really started writing about that a decade ago. And if anything, the gap has only exploded with millions of people going to, Jordan Peterson, Joe Rogan, and a whole slew of these guys, but not coming to the church. I think that's a huge problem. In fact, I devoted an entire chapter of the book to gender. But in that newsletter, I wrote up my little framework, what came to know as my three worlds framework, explaining the culture, and it went viral then. It was, the most popular piece I'd written by far. It really put me on the map as a commentator on these issues. Then later, First Things Magazine asked me to create an updated version for their publication, and that came out in February 2022 and ended up being maybe the most talked about article in the history of the magazine. Went extremely viral. And then, of course, I turned it into this book, Life in the Negative World, which I was able to essentially refine a lot of my frameworks based on the reactions that people had, the questions, and even the criticisms. And then also to be able to give some more perspective on, okay, now that we know the cultural environment, what should we do? And again, I'm gratified that it's getting a lot of attention and it's reaching people that I may not have reached through my newsletter or through First Things. And so I just want to keep putting this out here.
I have been a longtime subscriber to your email newsletter, and I really appreciate the way that I do appreciate how you approach these things differently than I think either evangelicals who are pastors or people who are in the academy, because there's certain, blinders, for lack of a better word, so I've really appreciated your voice on these issues. So as you said, the three worlds framework that kind of went viral a couple different times. Can you tell us more about that framework and why do you think it's helpful in 2024?
Sure. This framework is a way of explaining what has happened in the relationship between Christianity and culture over the last 60 or so years. And it's a little different than something like H. Richard Niebuhr's Christ and culture model. A lot of people look at how the church has viewed culture. My model is about how culture has viewed the church. And so, although we never had a state church like they do in Europe, for most of our history, we did have a sort of softly institutionalized generic Protestantism as our default national religion. So, as recently as the 1950s, half of all adults attended church every Sunday. We had prayer and Bible reading in public schools. We were adding "In God We Trust" to our money, under God to the Pledge of Allegiance. It was essentially again, generic Christian sort of default culture in the country. In the 1960s, that began to come unraveled, and Christianity went into decline in America, a decline that continues to the present day. And I divide this period of decline from, say, 1964 to the present into three eras or worlds that I call the positive world, the neutral world, and the negative world. So the positive world lasts from 1964 to 1994. And I want to be clear, things are not going well for Christianity. All is not positive for Christianity here. Church attendance is down. For example, the sexual revolution is happening, and yet society, our culture, elite culture, basically views Christianity positively. To be known as a good church-going man makes you seem like an upstanding member of society. Christian morality is still the basic morality of society. And if you violate those norms, you could get into real trouble. In 1994, we hit a tipping point and enter what I call the neutral world, which lasts from 1994 to 2014. And then the neutral world, Christianity is not seen positively anymore, but it's not really seen negatively yet either. It's just one more lifestyle choice among many in a sort of pluralistic public square. So we might meet. I'd say, I'm a Christian. You'd say, great, I'm a vegan. Let's talk.
Sure.
And, Christian morality had a sort of residual effect. Then in 2014, we hit a second tipping point and enter what I call the negative world, where for the first time in the 400-year history of America, sort of official elite culture now views Christianity negatively, or certainly at least skeptically. We can drill into that if you want. All along the history of our country, going back to the founding fathers, there were a lot of people who weren't personally believers, personally devout, but Christianity was held publicly in honor. That's what's changed today. To be known as a Bible-believing Christian does not help you get a job in the elite sectors of society. Christian morality is expressly repudiated and in many ways is seen as the new leading threat to the new public moral order. And this shift into the negative world has really been very dislocating to evangelicals who have been used to thinking themselves as, in the name of the old organization, the moral majority, something that's no longer true.
Okay, if I could zoom in on that, on the negative world, what do you think was the tipping point that brought us from a neutral, if there was a single tipping point, that brought us from a neutral world to a negative world? You write that we have not been this way before. So you really think this is something that the church needs to take on board and just realize that it's happened, and that so we don't, we're not the ostrich with its head buried in the sand. But what are the markers that you point to and say this shows that we have entered a new negative world?
Well, I don't. I'm not one of these "where did it all go wrong" people.
Okay,
And if you put this in a longer framework, what we see is this was a sort of contingent outworking of forces that extend far back into the past. And
okay,
so, for example, we would read a book like A Secular Age by Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher. He tells essentially a 500-year story arc of secularization, even further back, going back, a couple hundred years before the Reformation, and how the sort of evolution of culture in the West trended towards creating this, secular society, of which we all know, of which the period that I'm studying is just a very narrow kind of point of view. And so what I see is really like the negative world. If Christianity's in decline, then at some point it's going to go negative. You're just going to hit the 0
sure,
point and go below the 0 point. So I do think there's something about that. I highlight a couple of major events in the book, one of which is the collapse of the Protestant establishment. I don't think we need to go into that right now, but I think a very important one was the collapse of the Soviet Union, to the point where I could have a debate over whether the neutral world, you could date it really to 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Why were we adding "In God We Trust" to our money and "Under God to the Pledge" in the 1950s? It's the Cold War. So we're
sure.
involved in the Cold War. There is this global battle that's, military, it's economic, it's moral, with the Soviet Union on a global basis. And of course, communism was an avowedly atheist materialist system. They persecuted Christians and, religious people. And so Christianity was really bound up with the West's moral battle against communism. So long as, that Cold War was ongoing, you really can't become anti-Christian. It would be impossible. But after the Soviet Union collapsed, that opened the door to unbundle Christianity from what it meant to be a sort of Western democratic liberal democracy. And so I think we get there. Obviously, like the Obergefell decision was a major milestone, but I really don't want to dial in too much on that, because I think people really want to fixate on sexual issues, when in fact it's much, much broader than that. And we could talk
Sure.
about that with that more if you'd like. But I don't want to become overly fixated just on the sexual issues. Although I think obviously going back to the 1960s and such, that was obviously a component of what was happening in society. But even back then, it wasn't just the sexual revolution. There were a lot of other things going on.
That makes perfect sense to me. I remember you talking in the book about Obama's second term, which is right when you're 2012 to 2016, when you're saying that this change is taking place. And it occurs to me, and I'm not remembering if this is in the book, but that's around the time that we really see the rise of the nuns, which I read a lot of Ryan Burge's stuff. And as a demographer in Lyman Stone, they're talking about how it's really insane. Not insane. That's not really the great word. It's unprecedented, the amount of people who have become religiously unaffiliated. And so it just makes sense to me on a sort of a kind of a duh level, that people who are no longer affiliated with Christianity, they were, and now they are not anymore, would start to form a solid a group of people in this country who have a negative view of Christianity. And I think uh, to your book, you're especially talking about elites. Elites are people, or in right now in the negative world, elites have a negative view of Christianity.
Yeah.
And as a side note, Is that a fair assumption, or would you say that that is extending through every level of society?
Yeah, I do think what I'm talking about is mostly an elite phenomenon, as are most of these ideologies that we see today that aren't especially, something like defund the police. If you look at the polling, it's not especially popular in the black community. That they want more policing, they want better policing. They
Right.
don't want abusive policing. They certainly would want reform, but they don't want no policing.
Yeah.
But
Here in Minneapolis, it was black voters who defeated the defund the police amendment.
yeah, yeah.
It was very striking.
Yeah. So, but where I would, I think, maybe put a little nuance is uh, that perhaps, again, skeptical might be a little better word than negative, because merely identifying as a Christian does not necessarily get you in trouble.
Sure.
You've got someone like Senator Raphael Warnock from Georgia, who is literally a black pastor of a church there.
Hmm.
Pete Buttigieg would tell you, I'm an Episcopalian. I'm Christian. The point is, of course, they're on the left, and all of what they believe is completely aligned with today's sort of secular zeitgeist.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, if you tell people, I'm a Christian, people might look at you a little skeptically, but it's really only if the contents of your Christianity materially conflict with the sort of new secular moral line that you end up getting in trouble. Which, of course, you can get in trouble for
Sure.
those violations, even if you're not religious at all. And of course, that's one of the trends that's emerged in the negative world. And I think essentially Donald Trump is in part a result of this phenomenon, is what I call the post-Christian right. I think a lot of evangelicals conflate kind of their, the status of Christianity in America with the electoral prospects of the Republican Party. Political parties exist to win elections. So, if your political party starts losing, political parties are going to pivot to whatever it takes to win elections. And so, clearly Republicans have the ability to win at essentially every level of government, in America. Donald Trump might well win this year. Will he? I don't know. But the fact is, it's not ludicrous to say that he might win. And in fact, he's even leading in the polls. But that doesn't mean that Christianity is leading in the polls, right? The Trump voters are not necessarily people who are animated by social conservative concerns or religious concerns. Although most evangelicals voted for Donald Trump and probably will again, Donald Trump's base is people who are sort of more animated by cultural issues around things like immigration or trade, things of that. It's a lot of people who are kind of the nuns, if you will, or they're affiliated. They might claim the evangelical label, but they don't go to church, and their lives aren't that. And so we see that even in Ohio, which is now a very deeply red state. The elections are going to come in. J.D. Vance is going to be the senator. Trump's probably going to win in Ohio, right? And yet it's like, referendums approving abortion and, drug legalization. I think, we're reaching a point where, huge tracts of, people on the political right in America actually, are completely out of alignment with what you might have considered the religious right. And so that's an important phenomenon and an important distinction to make.
I think that
Always
does.
the chamber of commerce people had no real interest in. I think even Republican elites have long been skeptical of kind of the evangelical concerns. I mean, evangelicals have essentially been used as essentially a vote bank or a voting block, for the Republican Party. The candidates stir up all the scaremongering and resentment and, get people to vote. And, obviously there's been a lot of money, frankly, put into the political infrastructure to make evangelicals politically loyal to the Republican Party. But I can tell you, like, you go to the average DC think tank and these people, they're by and large socially liberal people. They're not libertinists, by any means, but except for the few people who really are themselves deeply religious, by and large, the ethos there is, we just want to like cut taxes and we want to do stuff like that,
Sure.
and we want more immigration and we want all this stuff, and it's really not. They never were that into that. So you've always got kind of called the Chamber of Commerce people who had no interest in it, and now what you've got is this large kind of populist bloc who also has no interest in it, or certainly it's like far from their leading concern. And so I think that's going to be an interesting political situation as well for evangelicals.
You mentioned the moral majority, and that's in the book, and you talk in the book about this sort of the bargain that type of grouping, evangelicals who are really politically active, the bargain that they made with conservative Republicans. Certainly starting before Newt Gingrich, but Newt Gingrich's contract with America, it would be a classic example of that. And and you also write with some skepticism about both of those things. The idea of the moral majority, was it ever a moral majority? And then also that alliance, that bargain that we and the church have made. And you write, if as one of the largest voting blocs on in the conservative coalition, is the only thing that we have really gotten out of that, pro-life judges. And if that's true, is it worth it? But I want to come back to that moral majority point, because I think you write in the book, what we're talking about now is a moral minority, and we need to accept that as sort of one of our base assumptions for how we move forward. What should we doing? What should we doing instead of claiming to be a moral majority?
Well, one of the things one of the big themes in the book is that evangelicals need to undergo a major mindset shift to start thinking like a minority. Because when you are a minority, that doesn't mean that you hate America or that you're negative towards society, but you recognize, hey, the institutions of society are not designed around me, right? They're designed around the majority. Now, there may not be a majority today. But so, for example, historically, American institutions, American culture was essentially oriented around a Protestant normative society. So there really was no differentiation between, call it Protestant institutions and American institutions. Protestants didn't really need per se their own institutions because our colleges and universities were by and large, Harvard, Princeton, and Yale were sort of, Protestant. Now, even up through the mid-century era, in which those were sort of liberal Protestant institutions, they were still, self-consciously and, clearly in their identity Protestant. That's one of the major subtexts of William F. Buckley's The Controversy over his book, God and Man at Yale, from like 1951, is that he was this Irish Catholic guy who'd been invited into Yale, into Skull and Bones, and then he graduates and he sort of trashes the university. And, the old, WASP elites, the white Anglo, they were very incensed by this. And so that was a big part of it. And, there's a lot to unpack there. But, when you're a minority, you got to say, well, that's not going to be true of us. And therefore we have to have institutions and practices that demarcate and sustain community life in a country where you're not the majority. Of course, there's many different kinds of minorities, not all of which are really good models for evangelicalism, but the one that I kind of highlight is early 20th century Catholicism. So again, prior to World War II, America was kind of an anti-Catholic country to a great extent. You had all these Catholic immigrants coming here, and they sort of said, look, if we want to remain Catholic, faithful Catholics, sustain our cultural community, we need to have our own churches. We need to have our own parish schools. We need to have our own universities. We need to have our own fraternal society. We need to have a parallel Catholic infrastructure that supports and sustains Catholic life in America, which they created. And even after they were admitted into the mainstream institutions and, accepted into the mainstream institutions, they never let go of their own institutions. And so, that's something that we need to start thinking too, is that. And the other thing is like when you're a majority, there is sort of an implied obligation towards investment in and stewardship of the mainstream institutions of society. When you're a minority, that is not the case. And there's a lot of gaslighting going on. I think of evangelicals to keep them invested in sort of the mainstream. You need to pursue the common good, and you need to be, salt and light, which is fine. I'm not saying telling people exactly what to do, but the reality is, okay, we're a minority now, and the interesting one everybody can understand is education. In the 50s when we had prayer and Bible reading in school, right, and not just any, right, the King James Bible and all that. It's like, yeah, that was, they were essentially Protestant controlled schools. Well, that's certainly not the case now. The people running the public schools are certainly not evangelicals. They don't share the values. They're actually hostile to the values. And so this idea that, you need to be an active supporter of the public schools, I just reject. We need to care much more. Minorities have to care about sustaining their own community health. And so that needs to be a focus of evangelicals to a much greater extent. Again, it doesn't mean hating other people or fighting with other people. Frankly, there should probably be less fighting. You guys, you do you, a little bit. I think there is a little sense in which we need to adopt that, which is candidly what the New Testament church did at a time when they were a minority in Rome. They weren't trying to reform Rome, but nor were they trying to prop up the institutions of the Roman Imperium. They're like, here's this Roman Empire, and we need to accommodate ourselves to it with the greatest extent possible while we focus on both evangelism, but also the health of our own community. We're going to take up a collection for the saints in Jerusalem. We're going to be taking care of our people first. And then as, of course, it strengthens, it spills over more and more into others. And of course, as the empire Christianizes, then the aperture of their ambitions expanded. And we're certainly not in we're certainly not in New Testament church territory by any means. I always say there's no real persecution in the United States today. Nevertheless, I think that idea of, rethinking the relationship between church and culture when you're a minority is really a psychological break that needs to take place. And again, exactly how that's instantiated in the world, has to be developed. But I think it's the mentality. We are a minority now. So how do we think like that? Not in the sense of becoming a bitter or an angry or a hateful minority, but just like, okay, great. How do other minorities, how do the early 20th century Catholics, how do other minorities in the United States behave? And again, not every minority group is a great model for us, but I think that's something we should be thinking about.
That reminds me of a book I read in college, The Madonna of 115th Street, by Robert Orsi. And he was studying a particular Roman Catholic parish in Harlem. And it was a really interesting book. There was this really thick community around the parish, and specifically it was an Italian-American parish. And they had a Madonna statue that was supposed to have some sort of miraculous properties. I don't remember the details of that. And as a Protestant, I'm not, endorsing that. But the yearly festival of the Madonna, I don't know if it was another or particular saint day that it was celebrated, or if it was unique to that parish. But it was something that unified this immigrant population, even after the linguistic distinctions had been erased and they weren't that different from the Irish Catholics in the next parish. And so that seems like, to your point, something that would, that sort of practice, not endorsing that particular practice, but the sort of practice where evangelicals can. It's tough because evangelicals don't want to talk about, I think, putting up any sort of barriers or walls, because I think a lot of evangelicals, and maybe this gets to your point, we think, well, if we do weird stuff, if we do stuff that sort of helps create not insular in a bad way, but a community that's built around these distinctives, the sacraments, weekly worship, etc., that make us look weird in the community, then we're going to lose our ability to do effective evangelism, which at least in some culture, in some situations within the U.S., evangelism is kind of, some of it is based on aping cultural institutions. Hillsong and others, really huge churches. Their music is taken from. They try to draw people in by literally having Justin Bieber or having music that sounds like Justin Bieber. And
Right.
so it seems like you're saying, no, Christians need to, you're not talking about liturgy per se, you're not making theological prescriptions, but that you're talking about socially and culturally, Christians need to hold on to their unique identity first, and then we talk about how we evangelize in that context. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think there's been this kind of default assumption, that the church is okay, and it's really it's just the lost who need help. And there's this
Sure.
line I quote in the book. It's from some early 20th century British guy who says the church is the only institution that exists for the benefit of those who are not yet members. And there's a sense in which that's true, but evangelism is not the sole purpose, of the church. It is not like the only thing the church does, and so I think sustaining, discipleship and sustaining of our own communities are very important. And you sort of mentioned, I think, I highlight, in addition to the three worlds, three major strategies or approaches that evangelicals took to church over the years. Two from the positive world is where they originated. One in the neutral world. So in the positive world, it was the culture war, religious right, moral majority, and the seeker sensitivity movement. And
Mm.
then in the neutral world, it was what I call the cultural engagement movement, or the urban church. And so you can think of, the culture war as being a transformation strategy. We're going to transform the country through political action to more align with what, we believe God wants. I think with the seeker sensitive, which is really the progenitor of what we know as the non-denominational suburban megachurch, was, as you say, very focused on being relevant. If you go back to like the origins in the 1970s, it's like, let's get rid of everything about church that people don't like, choir robes, stodgy hymns, denominational distinctives, anything that's off putting. So evangelicals, and I think one of the strengths of evangelicalism has been its adaptability and its ability to stay relevant. But we've been very focused on what you might call relevance. And so, and in fact, transformation and relevance are two of the four major styles of church that Tim Keller listed in his church planning book, Center Church. And evangelicalism has been very, very concentrated in those two buckets. And there's a third bucket of being a counterculture that I think we've been weaker in. There are kind of evangelical counterculture people, like the new monastic movement, but I would say there's been much more focus on being sort of assimilated to the culture, in a sense, relevant to the culture, than there has been in being distinct from the culture, having our own culture. And again, part of going from majority to minority thinking is saying, wait a minute, we need to have a culture that is meaningfully distinct from the secular culture in some important way. Because if we don't have that, then what do we really believe?
I think that's really, I'm hearing you talk, and it really reminds me of sort of the community that I find myself in right now, where it's all these younger people with college degrees living in a very secular city, and most of them have found, uh, these are married families with young kids at this point, generally. And so most of them have found, in whatever tradition they're in, have found a way for their churches to be countercultural. For example, in some of my just friends that are local here, by becoming Anglican, becoming Eastern Orthodox, in my case, becoming Lutheran, and finding a really strong, thick community bounds and liturgical boundaries. And I'm not saying that everyone has to do that. Um, and then creating a homeschool group that has people who are Anglican, Eastern Orthodox, Lutheran, and forgetting a couple, and who are all doctrinally as are definitely not on the same page about some major things, but who are willing to come together because they see the need that you just mentioned to be countercultural. Not even, the Christian schools around here. I'm sure many of them are great, but at 12 or 8 and 15,000 a year, I'll never find out how good they are for my children. So I think that's really I see that and I see people without having read your book yet, although I will recommend it to all of them. They see that necessity. They understand that if our family wants to continue the values that our parents and perhaps our grandparents held, it's going to be a more of a fight than it was for them, and there needs to be more countercultural, more questioning of the norms. I think maybe the attitude toward Disney and our cultural, the cultural products of the mainstream culture is much more hostile among the younger millennials that I interact with than perhaps it was in my parents' generation when Disney was sanitized, kid friendly.
Yeah, well, I sense one of the subtexts of what we see is there has been this sort of especially among young men, a sort of draw towards Eastern Orthodoxy. I think people are looking at some of these other traditions, and I think one of the subtexts of that is the sense that the sort of ground is eroding under kind of under our feet, and therefore people are looking for solid ground to stand, and so they're looking at things that seem to be older, seem to be ancient, seem to have been around a long time. Let's go find a more rooted tradition and come to that, because we're seeing the cultural ground eroding under our feet here. There's sort of a perception that evangelicalism is very shallow in terms of its practices. It doesn't really have the resources to sustain. And so I think that's definitely a big, part of that. I think a lot of these moves, come in part because you're not getting what you think you need where you are today. And of course, I think
Right.
that's been a long, I think even going, people who convert to Catholicism from evangelicalism, are driven by some of the same impulses. It's like, well, there isn't this intellectual tradition there, or it's a counter with church history, but there seems to be some lack, a perception of lack. I don't want to be too critical of people who convert. But I also want to say, I think that there's, in some sense, a push more than a pull in some of these
Sure.
cases, where it's like, um, there's a sense of deficiency, and in some cases, even alienation that underpins it.
I think probably important to say neither you nor I are going to tell people join X denomination or whatever, but this does get at the point where that you said earlier, evangelicalism has become adaptable, and that's been part of its great strength. But as you also stated, there's this sense of shallowness, and those things probably go really closely together.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
and I think it's important, the work of just to mention one name, Gavin Ortland, at looking at the historical depth of Protestantism, and he's a pretty standard issue Baptist, but he's arguing for recovering uh, a Protestantism steeped in the early church. It's not going to, of course, look identical to the early church, and there's going to be, of course, still strong liturgical differences with other the Roman Catholics or Eastern Orthodox, but there is a there is something that people can find a deep and thick community in without making some sort of religious change. And I should mention, I know Baptist churches just here in the Twin Cities that are doing that are moving towards, for example, a more historic liturgy and a more theological conversation rather than the
Hmm.
evangelism at all costs model. Um,
Yeah,
some of your
there is a rich body of work from Reformation era thinkers that is actually quite sophisticated. If you think there's something that they haven't considered, they've thought through all of the stuff, and we don't have to agree with all of their answers, but there really is a quite comprehensive and sophisticated body of work there. That modern evangelicalism has become completely detached from. And I definitely see kind of a push back towards that. But again, what people are trying to do is sort of they're trying to take the cafeteria plan. That's kind of my
Right.
observation on that stuff, because there's a lot of things that they believed that are sort of anathema to many Americans. There was a guy named Stephen Wolfe who wrote a book called The Case for Christian Nationalism that was essentially an exposition of Reformation era political theology. And I don't claim to be an expert on that. And I've always said I'm not a Christian nationalist. I don't think Christian nationalism is part of our cultural or political heritage. At the same time, when I see things over this, it's very clear that the people who really rejected Stephen Wolfe, essentially reject the Reformation era thinking as well, and sort of think that like essentially aspirational 1980s conservatism, what they wish, a little more pro-life, a little more of these things, right? That is really the Bible's political theology. They're really wedded, I think, to the very people who critique, the making an idol out of America themselves put, essentially sacralize the American post-war, post-civil rights system as somehow normative. And that's extraordinarily difficult to escape because we're all a product of our culture. That's why
Hmm.
I'm not going to pretend I'm not an American. I'm an American. I think like an American, and there's a lot of culture there. But so I do think that is kind of a challenge. I think for some of the Protestant movement is this a desire to somewhat cherry pick, which is something you really can't do in Eastern Orthodoxy. I mean, you could cherry pick it in practice, but Catholicism and Orthodoxy really are sort of complete packages that you can't just remix. You can't just take a little bit here and a little bit there, put together your own thing. Whereas you kind of can do that a little bit with Anglicanism, for example, which is a very broad tradition.
That's I want to zoom in on what you just said about the whole Christian nationalism discussion, and really not perhaps that term exactly, but this idea that Christians right now, if you ask them what's your talking about people in the pews, not academics, what's your ideal Christian polity, and they might say, as you said, your 1980s economic boom. Ronald Reagan is, if not an evangelical himself, although maybe he was, he's made friends with evangelicals in a way that very few presidents before him had done, and certainly came from a much more humble background than many presidents before him, which made it easier for him to talk to evangelicals without spurning them or dismissing them like someone like Nixon or LBJ might have done. And that's really interesting to me. The idea that Christians right now have this idea that, you know, if we let's say we had a Christian president, after the next 4 years, we get someone other than Donald Trump or Joe Biden on the ballot, and we're going to have someone who's going to bring us back to a place where we can all be nice and respect each other and have that sort of consent and not consensus, but have a return to the positive world, to use your framework. So I guess maybe this is a tough question, but if you're saying that's unrealistic, and I tend to agree with you, what should Christians be looking for in terms of our political engagement?
Yeah, that's one I wish I had been able to develop more. There is a chapter on that. The last chapter of the book sort of deals with that. And what we've seen is essentially two approaches to sort of political and cultural engagement by evangelicals. Sort of, there's to call it the culture war side has essentially said we need to double down. And the real problem, the reason things went poorly, is because the previous generations of the religious right didn't fight hard enough. And this is kind of an echo of we need to fight as nasty as they do. That's why we're going to vote for Donald Trump. There is a sense of it's a more, we were too gentlemanly, we were too wedded to the system, but the system was rigged. right? Because, everything big is decided by the courts now, or it's decided by, corporations. Because, so it's like, I think there's like that. We just need to fight harder. And I think, the idea of like Christian nationalism, I think, is based very much in that. It's like, well, why don't we just be more unapologetic? So there's sort of a theme there. And so I think what there is a somewhat admirable part in saying, well, let's just disconnect ourselves from 80s zombie Reaganism or whatever, which really wasn't biblical in a way. It doesn't mean it was all bad. There's good things that were there, but I don't think the Bible like prescribed the tax cuts of 1986 or something like that. Those are matters of prudence. At the same time, I mean, we have never been further from a sort of Christian system in America, and the public doesn't support most of what evangelicals want. I mean, the positions are unpopular, around abortion, around, even just drug legalization. Any other thing you might say there, gambling. Those are all things I think that are very indicative of the decline of Christianity. The fact that we have gambling, super saturated with gambling, all the drug legalizations of things like payday loan stores, financial predatory finance. All of this stuff is a product of a kind of a negative world post-Christian environment. There's a reason this stuff is metastasized as Christianity went into decline. So it's like, well, we're going to come back. And that's why I like to get away from the sexuality issues or abortion, because they're such flashpoints. Let's just pick something that isn't like that, like pot legalization or gambling. There's no constituency for essentially getting rid of either of those things. Now, I do think, there are some concerns over sports betting, and that we'll dial that. We'll make some massage in it, but the idea that like we're just going to be a super saturated society in which these big gambling enterprises prey on problem gamblers to get rich, we're not going to change that. And I think that's like part of it is like people aren't interested. The other way people have engaged is, to essentially promote disengagement, unilateral disarmament, if you will, from sort of any Christian conservative positions. And again, you often hear this sort of like Anabaptist inflected politics. Jesus didn't come to exercise power. Jesus came to give up power. Christians are supposed to give up power. We lose down here. Things like that. You hear a lot of talk like that. And the whole idea being that, any pursuit of or exercise of, power, political power, cultural power by Christians is de facto illegitimate. And these are people who essentially want to surrender, sort of in my view, and sort of say, look, we're just going to move back within the four walls of our church and hope people leave us alone here a little bit. But of course, these people, most of them have no intention of not pursuing aggressive engagement in areas where they're in alignment with the culture. So they're all very, very loud about racism. They're all very, very loud about immigrants. I'm like, wait a minute. What happened to this disengagement stuff? You're not disengaging from the select issues that are popular, that are going to make people like you. So I think it's kind of, to me, it's a little bit fake. But that's a little too much for some people. I sort of say, if you want to go live like a truly disengaged life, that's one thing. But I think the selectivity of it is something else. But again, there's the old line. I think it's attributed to Trotsky originally. You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. And I think there is a sense you may not be interested in politics, but politics is interested in you. I don't think you could run away to a backwoods bubble and think you're going to escape what's happening. So I just think, we need to be, prudentially engaged citizens, in the political and cultural processes of America. When I think part of that means recognizing the reality of the cultural position that we're in. The church did one thing, when it was a tiny persecuted minority in Rome. It did something else post-Constantine. And so what to do, the outworkings of those things, sometimes take, longer than we think. There may be things that, people aspire to do that's like, well, it's probably not going to happen. But what can be done, right? And how can we, create? So I think there's a lot there. And that's why I say I don't want to be prescriptive. As a matter of sort of prudential judgment, it's going to require people to be wisdom. But I do think the idea of like, delegitimizing any exercise of political power by an evangelical, it's because there are states that have evangelical governors. That's probably not going to happen in Minnesota, but it's the case in Tennessee
Never
right
say
now.
die.
It's the
Right.
case in Tennessee right now. So it's what's a guy like Bill Lee in Tennessee supposed to do? If he's not supposed to exercise power. Of course, he has to be wise in how he
Right.
does that and take account of like the entire like situation where he is, because that's the role of a political leader. But the idea that he can't incorporate his values into how he governs seems a little strange.
It's interesting that you mentioned gambling because our session just ended last week, and along with other groups, we were instrumental in stopping gambling expansion this year in Minnesota. And it was a strange coalition where we worked with some other religious organizations, but also with some of the most progressive legislators in the body, whereas your more centrist and libertarian Republicans and Democrats were pushing forward on this. So that was an interesting vibe. I don't know whether anything. Another area where some of those senators have engaged, legislators who are really progressive have engaged with us is protections for children on the internet, which is an interesting possible area of commonality. And has not necessarily uh, reinforcing your point or going against it, but just an observation that when in the political loyalties and fault lines are shifting, there
Right.
may be
Exactly.
ground for evangelicals to build new partnerships and to create a new coalition that has slightly different, like if we focusing on religious freedom is, I think, one area where we can build common ground, while also not throwing our weight around and pretending that we're, um, you know, uh, that we need to be in charge because we have some sort of mandate from God.
Right. I think these coalitions would not be a coalition. I think it would be issue specific, which is very different from the way that things have traditionally been conceived within the Republican Party, where this Republican Party, the coalition exists within the Republican Party, which then takes control and does things. Whereas I think now it's going to be issue specific and may cut across different identities, political or otherwise. Um, there and advancing the ball on specific issues, I think is something we can definitely look at.
I want to give you an opportunity to talk to a big part of our audience, which is pastors. I think part of the reason I picked up your book, although I had been reading your essays for a long time, is that I was talking to to a pastor at one of the largest churches and one of the fastest growing churches here in the Twin Cities, and he mentioned your work, and I was like, "Was that an Aaron Renn reference?" And he said, "Yeah." And I was surprised and actually heartened that this church, which I consider to be pretty mainstream, was taking these ideas on board about being countercultural, about having to change the way that we think about cultural engagement uh, as part of their strategy. Um, what would you say to evangelical pastors in general about what do they need to do differently? What are they doing well now? What do they need to do differently so that they could sort of be more successful both in preserving the integrity of the church and, of course, in reaching out to their community?
Sure. I think all of the strategies that I said evangelicals had done in the past actually have things that they got right and were still relevant. So if you think about the culture war, the religious right, they understood that sometimes you have to be unpopular with elites. That's just, you have to be willing to be low status
Sure.
sometimes. I do think sort of the seeker sensitive megachurch mainstream, they did. Hey, let's not put artificial barriers between people and the gospel. Let's figure out how to reach people. And then, of course, I think the urban church did some of that as well, but they showed like respect for vocation, more interest in vocation, the life of the mind, the arts, things like that. So I think those are all things that people can draw from in terms of shaping something that's right for them. And the culture is so heterogeneous. The environment in suburban Minneapolis, St. Paul is going to be very different than small town Alabama, or if you're in say Massachusetts. I think that I'm a little hesitant there, but I do think this the themes around counterculture, strengthening community, and as such are there. Um, the actually the people of all those groups I mentioned, the people who've resonated most with my book are the people in sort of the broad evangelical middle. A lot of mega church pastors have loved it, and I don't think it's because I told them something they didn't already know. I think all of these people they're seeing this stuff. And all that
Hmm.
I did was sort of give a language and a framework to help them articulate it and kind of make sense of it and start thinking about how we might orient towards it. It's just sort of, I've had this experience in the past where I'll read a book by an author. I had this experience with Charles Taylor where I had already, it's like I'm like completing a 5,000 piece jigsaw puzzle, and I've got a whole bunch of people and there a whole bunch of pieces, and they're sort of assembled in clumps. And then all of a sudden, somebody says, "Hey, let me show you what the puzzle looks like," you know. And while you're putting
Sure.
this thing together, it's like, oh,
Hmm.
that really helps. And so I feel like hopefully that's a little bit there. I'm not like, oh, I'm not telling them something that they were clueless about. They already knew this stuff. They just hadn't put it into a framework like this. And so it's like, hopefully that's very useful to them there. And again, our evangelical leaders, they're highly entrepreneurial. And, so I'm hopeful that they can continue that trend of entrepreneurship for the negative world.
Sure. So we're coming to the end of our time, and I really appreciate you spending time in this conversation. I want to ask one more question, and I know this is a question with a longer answer, but um, you write a lot about the church's weakness in reaching men, and you referenced that today. It's a critical problem. What does the church need to do to stop making young men allergic to it, if that's the right word?
Yeah, that is a very long and complex subject, and the longest chapter in the book is on gender. I truly believe that the evangelical church has basically gotten it wrong on gender in important ways. I think it has a very weak anthropology of gender, in which the only thing people talk about as gender distinctions are like, can women be pastors or are men the head of the home? It's a very, very narrow, like a lot of the evangelical rhetoric is around those issues. Very little about the practicalities of life, like how do I actually find someone to marry in this environment in which we have all these dating apps and we have declining marriage rates, and how do I stay married in a nation that has a 40% divorce rate? There's a lot there. So I don't think if someone like Jordan Peterson and these influencers are speaking directly to the problems that men are and concerns that men are speaking today, the church by and large isn't. And then secondly, I don't think it's any secret that churches love to just beat up on men and tell them how they're screwing up and how they need to be, more servant leaders. And you just really have no legitimate interest of your own, sort of thing. You need to shut up and help with the kids more, do more dishes, that sort of thing. And again, that's a highly simplistic sort of view, but like the vision of what it means to be a man in the evangelical church is incredibly unappetizing. And again, I don't think it's an accurate representation either. But I think it's one we need. I think this is an opportunity for us to take a step back and say, okay, what have we gotten wrong? And I think things like gender. I do think there needs to be a lot of significant work done in the race area. Still, I don't think we've got it right. On that yet. Either again, that's not my area of expertise, but I'm not seeing a lot of compelling information there. I do think we need to think about political theology. So I think the debates over political theology are very healthy, and that we're starting to table the issue in the British sense of the word. We're thinking about about this, and so I think there's a number of these issues that are very big substantive issues where we need to have a lot of serious research, rethinking, and debate.
That's really helpful, and thank you for that. And I will say, it was a little unfair to spring that question on you with just a minute or two left in our time. And I was really grateful for the treatment of gender in this book. Folks, the book again is Life in the Negative World, Confronting Challenges in an Anti-Christian Culture. I believe it's available wherever books are sold. Aaron, I think this conversation will be helpful. This conversation today, I hope, will be helpful here in Minnesota. But I know you're having a lot of conversations, and that this book is prompting a lot of conversations in Christian communities around the country. And I think that I'm confident that you're forcing us to ask questions we haven't talked about before, or talk about in different ways than we have before, and helping us answer those questions in ways that will help us be more effective in our ministry in this new environment that we find ourselves in. So I want to thank you so much for what you've contributed and for this time today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. The book came out in late January, and I think here we are like 4 months later, and people still keep asking me for podcasts. So the interest has not slacked off.
That's great to hear. And I was late to the party. I picked it up in mid-May, and I think you'll probably be getting more interview requests because I don't think this conversation is going away. I think
Okay.
I think, and I bet you'll have material for a new book by the time you're done talking about this one. Aaron, thank you so much again, and I commend this conversation to our audience. We'll make sure that everyone hears, I think, about this conversation that we've been able to have today. I think it's really relevant here in Minnesota, just as relevant as it is anywhere else. So thank you again to Aaron Renn for joining us here on the Family Beacon podcast from Minnesota Family Council. Thank you so much.